Hi, my name is Monica Ramirez. I'm the president and founder of Justice for Migrant Women, and it is my honor to be here with you for Rural Assembly Everywhere for a special session on redefining rural America, elevating voices, and building power. And I am ecstatic to have some incredible friends and partners in the work here with me for this conversation. So, with me today, we have Ash-Lee Woodard Henderson, who is the co-executive director at the Highlander Research and Education Center. She's a longtime activist and community organizer working to win environmental justice in Central and Southern Appalachia and a multitude of issues, including labor, reproductive health and rights, ending anti-Black racism and police brutality, and more across the US South. Ash-Lee is an active participant in the movement for Black lives, and she's on the governance council for Southern Movement Assembly. Sarah Eagleheart is joining us, and she is an Emmy award-winning social justice storyteller, activist, media strategist, and producer focused on advocacy on behalf of Indigenous peoples, rooted worldview as an Oglala Lakota raised in Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. She is currently the CEO of Return to the Heart Foundation, and she is an internationally accomplished executive with a diverse background in tribal, corporate, and nonprofit organizations. Reyna Lopez is a leader and proud daughter of immigrants from Mexico who came to Oregon in the late 80s following the migration of farm work in the Marion County area. She is currently the executive director of PCUN, which was started by farm workers and is now Oregon's longest standing Latinx organization. So thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation. So I think that in order for us to get started, it's important to provide some framing for what it is that we're talking about and why it is so important. So for those of you who are tuning in, you should know that approximately 1/5 of Americans live in rural areas, including more than 19 million women. The perception is that rural America is white, but the reality is that rural America is comprised of individuals of many diverse backgrounds, including Latina, Indigenous, and Native, Black, and Asian women, and women of other races and ethnicities. A 2019 report from the Center for American Progress showed that 1 in 10 African Americans lives in a non-metro area. 5% to 20% of LGBT Americans live in rural areas, or approximately 2.9 million to 3.8 million people. And 1/5 of growing rural areas owe their population growth entirely to immigrants. Oftentimes, the diverse communities of rural America and their unique needs are left out of the conversation by our policymakers. I know that as a rural Latina, I often feel that sometimes policymakers are talking about what is good for our communities when they actually know nothing about our communities. And so we're having this conversation so that we can learn more about what the priorities are from individuals who are from rural America and therefore experts on what rural Americans need and the diverse communities who live in them. So, all right, let's start with our first question. So each of the communities that we represent have deep ties in rural America, though most people might not realize that that is the case. Could you each share a little bit about the community that you represent and serve, and how your community has shown up historically to build rural America across our country? Ash, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, and what an amazing space. What an incredible panel. I feel so honored to be one in the number with sisters who are doing life-saving work all over the country. So I just feel really honored to be in this space. So yeah, I mean, who are my people, right? My people are Southern. My people are Appalachian. My people are country. My people are mountain people. My people both come from lands that were colonized by white supremacists to force people off Cherokee and Chippewa land. I come from those people that are blackberry pickers and peach farmers and the land of Bradford pears. The scenic city, in fact, is where I was born. The land of Lookout Mountain and White Oak Mountain. I come from country people. And I think that the reason why that matters in a Southern and a Black experience is that there's a long legacy of all of the harms for sure.
Mhm.
But even more exciting to me is a long legacy of resistance. I come from East Tennessee, a place where the first abolitionist newspaper was published, right? There's a long history of us fighting for social justice and particularly for racial justice and Black liberation. I come from the land of the Southern worker. We did that. I come from the land of folks that were a part of the United Negro Improvement Association, Garveyites. One of the largest chapters was in my hometown, right? I come from a place where in the 30s and 20s, the Communist Party had a headquarters in New York and California and in East Tennessee.
Hmm.
I come from a place that has a long legacy of resistance. And I think that why that matters is it informs everything about who I am and what I do. That I would not be the kind of person that is the steward of a place like the Highlander Center, again, born in the mountains of Tennessee, if it weren't for this place that I was born. And what it means that the people that I know that are from there have been put in a position to have to choose whether they stay and have their labor exploited, deal with white supremacist violence, deal with homophobia and transphobia and xenophobia, and what it means for them to have to make a decision every day to stay in the place that they're from and to jump over hurdles to being able to stay where they're from. Being told that where they're from is something that they should be ashamed of, being blamed for all of the social ills of this country, and that they still resist and they still find joy and they still build community. That's the people that I'm from. Those are the people that I'm accountable to, and that's who influences all the work that I do.
Thank you so much, Ash. And Sarah, let's hear a little bit from you. Tell us about the community that you're from, that you serve, and how has your community historically shown up across rural America?
Yeah, Betty Washte, Wambli Shinawi Amatiapi. So good day, everybody. My Lakota name is Eagle Shawl Woman. I grew up on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, actually, and near a border town that was mostly a white farming border town of 1,100 people. and so I lived in the tribal community that was a mile outside of that little tiny town. And historically, our tribes are mostly rural. We have urban as well, but our tribes are rural, and we tend to be very nomadic. Obviously, like many rural people have to be, right? Like we have to go to the city to go shop and and maybe work and all of that. But our tribes are definitely nomadic in that way. And so for me, when I think about the place that I grew up in and actually everything that I do, I've been really fortunate in my life that I've done a lot of jobs that have been bridging communities. And so I've actually got to visit dozens and dozens of tribal communities, rural tribal communities, even up to Kivalina, Alaska, and to see the way that they live their lives, very similar to ours, right? Berry picking, Team Sela picking or turnip picking and braiding and like saving food for winter. I mean, even now, like in COVID, of course I lived in the city, I lived in LA, but when COVID happened, I returned back to my rural community and to be with my family. And even now, I think I've been felt so blessed to return back to the earth, really, and return back to traditional medicines and actually gathering the medicines and using the medicines, things like tea and sage or sweetgrass or even cedar. And I think, the meals that are prepared, and I think we have always showed up. I mean, and many times, like, rural women have been leading the resistance because we've been the most affected by it, right? I mean, I lived in a very rural area that I dealt with racial tension my entire life growing up because there was no way around it. I mean, there were only Oglala Lakotas and, white farming people. And so, of course, at 16 years old, I was leading a protest against my high school that had a warrior princess mascot ceremony, right? And so, and then fast forward to today and seeing the racist mascots removed on the highest levels of the NFL has been really rewarding to see that work has happened.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And okay, Reyna, so you and I, we have sort of a similar background in that we, serve and come from, farm worker communities. And I would love to hear from you a little bit about the community that you're serving and how the community has continued to show up in Oregon, where you live, and across the country.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you everybody for being here today and for bringing up this important conversation, because it's not just politicians that are trying to erase us from rural communities, but I've even heard it come from our philanthropic partners who want to keep us in the immigration box, don't want to talk to about the rural cohorts that they have, and others, frankly. And I think to myself, who does it benefit to only paint rural Oregon and rural America in this picture of poor white folks? For me, it all really starts with my own story, right? My family left rural Mexico following the migration of the work, where my family also came from generations of indigenous Tarasco people that cared for the land and who farmed for many generations in the past. And when I came to Oregon, it really was the story that has a story that's been heard before, right? Coming here for a better life. And as a child, I myself picked blueberries, marionberries, cherries, and picked worms, all kinds of stuff with my father. At PCUN, our mission is really to empower farm workers and working Latinx families here in Oregon. And we do that by building community, increasing Latinx representation in elections, and also policy advocacy at both the state and the national levels. We're based in a small town called Woodburn here in Oregon, and it's really in the heart of our Latinx community and one of the most vibrant agricultural areas in the state. It's also a majority Latinx municipality, and people here are farm workers, they're small business owners, they're immigrants, many of those people, indigenous people of Mexico and Central America, which also is really important that people understand that a lot of our gente, they still speak those indigenous languages. So, you know, you'll be walking down Little Front Street in Woodburn and hearing a family speak in Mixtec or in Purepecha, Zapoteco, Triqui, Mam, which we're seeing a lot of our Guatemalan community also become a force in our little town here. And we really view ourselves as a farm worker union, but we've become a lot more. I think that especially as generations start going into different fields, opening their little small businesses, we really expanded our scope to saying we're also low-wage working families. And our core values really stemmed from our ability to take action against exploitation and all of the effects that come with it, whether that's to the body, to the land. And we've been advocating for fair wages, pushing for economic security for our families, and just kind of reflecting on these difficult times, on gender-based violence, on global warming, on this pandemic, and all of the things that the caste systems that we're currently living in are magnifying. I hear some people wanting to go back to normalcy so bad, but I want to remind people that everything that had happened in the past, it was not working for agricultural workers. It wasn't working for BIPOC rural people. It wasn't working for women or gender non-conforming folks, and generally the families that we represent. And since 1977, our organization really has fought to be seen and heard in the economy. And I feel like today, this conversation is really exciting. And this time just brings so many different challenges and opportunities that we can talk about in a way that hasn't been before. So very excited to be here today and to get an opportunity to discuss with this awesome panel.
Thank you. And, you know, I loved listening to each of you in your responses, and just thinking through how each of you talked about our closeness to the land and how literally our communities have built the communities that we live in, but oftentimes our communities are not credited for building these communities, for building what is rural America, and you know, for all the contributions to our economy and to the country. And so I loved hearing about sort of all the resistance and all of the many contributions. But you know, there is a real problem in our nation. And it goes to some of what Reyna was saying around erasure, right? There's like this picture that is painted about who is rural America, and often we aren't counted in that description. And So, and it's BIPOC folks that are from the places where we live, and we know it's all around and all across rural America. And so I think that for those who are tuning in, I think it would be really important for you to each spend a little bit of time talking about both some of the challenges that you're working to confront right now. And I know you touched a little bit about that in your introduction, but you could just go a little deeper. Like, what are some of the challenges that you are working on right now, this moment, to overcome? And what is it that you are doing to face those challenges and to win those fights that we know so needs to be won? And I ask that with full sensitivity to the fact that often our communities, if they're talked about at all, it's from this place of powerlessness, or that we only have challenges, and never from the place of how we're actually organizing to win. So I offer that to say that this is an invitation to talk about some of the work that you're doing right now to confront some of the major challenges, with a real understanding that you're organizing every day to overcome them. So Ash, kick us off.
Can you hear me now? There we go. You can hear me now. Perfect.
We can hear you.
Blame rural broadband.
I know, it's an issue.
So that's also something that we're organizing around. But yeah, I think a lot of things. I think that what I wish people understood about rural America, particularly the rural South, which is just, it's what I know, is that it actually deals with a lot of the same issues that exist everywhere, right? So, for example, I might say that we're fighting white supremacy and white nationalism. But guess what? That's not just a phenomenon that is particularly unique to rural America.
Yeah.
Right? I've experienced white supremacy and white nationalism in major cities too, right? I would talk about extractive labor practices, right? And you heard Reyna and Sarah speak about that as well. Like, that's also capitalism. Guess what? It exists in the whole United States, right? Some things that I would add, though, that I think is particular. The South is the largest geographic region in the United States. It's also where the highest concentration of Black people in the country are. And so there are some things that are similar to a lot of places, but also that are showing up in really unique ways because of the high concentration of low wage work of African descended people, and it being in a place that's historically been like the center of racialized capitalism in no small way. We're dealing with what it means for it to be an election year. What it means for voter suppression, which is like the American way, to be so intensified in our region in this moment. We're dealing with the census, right? What does it mean to get country people out, to get the numbers counted when we're so underrepresented in the Electoral College, which shouldn't exist in the first place, right? And then, me and Monica talked about this, is like, what does it also then mean to be consistently the blame for it, right? Like, I'm so exhausted about being invited to panels to have conversations about what is it like to be Black in Trump country. And I'm like, well, actually, guess where he's from? Queens, New York. We didn't do that, right? Or think about Reaganomics and its impact on rural communities. Guess where he's from? California. We didn't do that. What we did do was like publish the first abolitionist newspaper in the country. What we did do was like give you a labor movement. You're welcome. What we did do was build up a Southern freedom movement that led to things like, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. You're welcome again, right? Like, we actually are the rural people are the literal foundation of the social movements in this country that have rocked us closer to the thing that has typically just been a myth of democracy in this country. So, I think that those things are really real for me. I want to talk a little bit about COVID, and then I want to pass it to my comrades, like, what it means to be, particularly from the South, and for my comrades from the Midwest, in states that didn't expand Medicaid right before a global pandemic like we've never seen, has been so influential to what people have been fighting against in this moment, right? Is that rural people are not living single issue lives. We're people of color. We are working class people. We are people that are impacted by policies that kill us slowly and white supremacist violence that kills us quickly, right? And we are living lives at the intersections of all of those identities and all of those contemporary realities that impact our material conditions. So when COVID hits, we were prepared, not because we had a lot of money, but because we had a lot of relationship, right? We were prepared because rural people are who taught this country about mutual aid. That if I've got something you don't got, let's trade and make sure we all got something, right? It was us that did that. It was our relationship to being able to communicate across long spans of land, right? That has been able to support folks to figure out how to make sure our needs get met when the state fails us. And so although this has been a year of great loss, I feel like there's a huge silver lining, because what we're seeing is folks coming together across sector, across issue in rural America, right? You're seeing the labor unions work with the Black Lives Matter activists, and you're seeing, and there are Black Lives Matter activists in rural America. You are seeing like immigrant justice and youth movement folks coming together to say like, yo, we're fighting for our lives. We're fighting not only to like protect democracy, but to actually build a new one, because this one actually doesn't work for us. And I think that gives me a lot of hope in a time that I think a lot of our folks, a lot of the narrative of the story about our folks is one of despair and lack and scarcity, when actually, we run stuff. We run stuff. We're the visionaries that actually are building a new America.
Thank you. I love that so much. We're the visionaries that are building a new America. So much there. All right, Sarah, you also, you talked about this a little bit, but talk more, if you will, about, building from what Ash was talking about related to COVID. Can we start there? Because I know that in the last few months, you've really been working a lot on that particular issue. And then if you will just share a little bit more about some of the issues that you're really taking on through your work, and what are some of the ways in which you're confronting those?
Sure. Yeah, I think, we all have to pick where we can jump in and help. And I think where I've seen spending my energy is really on connecting, because I can connect with philanthropy. I can connect with influencers. For me, the most important thing has been working on narrative change, because if you're living in rural America, you know that nothing changes until something changes in like mainstream society, right? And so that's why I've really focused on it, because my community, has over 80% unemployment. I mean, it's a very rural, poverty-stricken community. And we are dealing with, we have over 50,000 tribal members in one area in South Dakota, right? And this is just my tribe, right? We have 574 tribes across the United States. But my tribe is one of the largest, and is actually the largest in the Midwest as well. And so for me, the work has really been narrative change, but also getting the money, getting the resources to the women that are doing the work on the ground, and also supporting them, because it's a part of power building. So for example, even in my community, half of our population is actually under the age of 18. So we are having a baby boom, and we are beginning to trickle over into all of the border towns, even my own border town, and even in the cities nearby. And so when you think about within 10 years, we could actually have 40 to 50% of the vote in South Dakota, and the state can swing. So it's all about educating that young vote right now, and like making sure that they're registered, they understand why they need to vote. And obviously COVID, we're also supporting COVID and getting PPE to these communities and to these women who are on the ground organizing. One of the things that I've often said is that, Indigenous women are in the middle of their community. Many of us are, right? But the women are the ones that are organizing. Of course, they were doing COVID relief. Of course, they were doing Get Out the Vote. They're also doing the census, right? And so those were the women that really needed to be supported. And so we found a way through a fellowship program that we called the Society, and we identified fellows across the nation who are working in areas of organizing, but also are working on narrative change, and they're also artists. And so for us, that was sort of the sweet spot that we could really begin to see impact. And then with this group, we're also working with Sisters Rising, which is a project of Justice for Migrant Women, Return of the Heart Foundation, and also We Stand United. I think I said that. But that's really been where we found that we could focus. And obviously, COVID has hit our people harder. And so we needed to have, and also the the federal funding and the support when we're very reliant upon it because our treaties have given us that health and benefit is real, but when it's substandard and you're dealing with disproportionate rates of COVID amongst your people, I mean, that's the scary part right now, because one of the things that I love about growing up in rural America, and that I see now that I've lived and grown up all over, lived and worked all over, is that we have a very deep sense of our identity and our culture and our language. And I got that because I grew up within this indigenous worldview, which you sometimes don't get if you're in an urban area or what have you. But because that was so strong for me, my identity of giving back and helping my people has really driven my work and everything that I do in my life. But I feel like, you know, sometimes when we don't have that, the work of decolonization, not only amongst our people, but also amongst like mainstream America, is a lot of work to like lift up and do. And so that's a lot of, you know, for women like me to have to carry that burden, but we do because we care about the impact on the ground and in my own community.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for all that you're carrying and for, you know, all the work that you've brought forward. Now, Reyna, you talked a little bit about the fact that PCUN considers itself a union, but now it's become more of a community organization for families. But I just want to put a point on something, because I think most people who are tuning in probably don't realize that under federal law, farm workers actually can't unionize. And so I want to start there, because I think that it's important to talk about the fact that you're able to create a union in Oregon and what that means. And then if you could just share a little bit more about, you know, some of the major challenges that are confronting your community right now, you know, in addition to some of the historic challenges, but what are some of the things that are pressing right now, and how have you been mobilizing to confront those?
Thank you. I think that that's a really important nuance to make sure we lean into, because it is true. For agricultural workers are left out of the National Labor Relations Act, and we legally don't have the protections in place to have collective bargaining rights and to unionize. But despite that fact, 80 farm workers back in the 80s that really started PCUN, they had a si se puede spirit about it, and they went for it. They were so inspired by the work that was happening in Delano. In fact, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez came up and helped us start our union. And we're like, we're going to do it. We're going to try to make it happen. And it has meant that we've had to be really creative with the way that we organize workers. And a lot of it has come through our worker center, where workers come and bring complaints from the field so that we can organize around that. And then people get supports through the organizing program or through our legal supports. And that's how we've been able to build a union membership of over 6,000 members. And today, I mean, we are still dealing with those exclusionary practices, the exclusionary legacy, really, that I would say really came from racism and slavery, that meant that we were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. And today that plays out in healthcare, it plays out in wages, in all kinds of things, and immigration status. And one thing I'll say too is that for a lot of our movement, we try to also raise awareness about the fact that a lot of the things that we do have, the little maybe that we do have, or the resilience that we've been able to build, we also want to thank our Black sharecroppers who really fought for a lot of those things that we have today. So, I mean, I think that connecting those dots between movements is really important. And one of our movement leaders always says, you know, Frederick Douglass is one of my inspirations in our farm worker organizing, and connecting the Black movement to our Latinx folks. To me, that's a really important place to make that connection. Immigration status is still a huge conversation. Everywhere we go, it's still a conversation. People want to know when we're going to be getting it, how we're going to be getting it. And it still has been the reason why we have basically created a second class of workers who are not able to speak up when there are abuses in the fields, when there are abuses in the labor housing. And we're also seeing that even within that, it's created another class of treatment as well for our women and our indigenous people who are out in the fields as well, with, you know, hearing about the sexual violence that's happening in the fields, or also the intense discrimination that's happening against our indigenous folks from even within our own communities. So immigration is definitely still a big challenge that we are fighting for, and we're trying to get legal status for our comunidad, as well as the wildfires. I mean, the Northwest and really the West Coast in general has been hit really hard by wildfires and the pandemic, but kind of creating this perfect storm that has caused for a lot of people to fall through the cracks during the emergency response. You know, we're called essential, but yet not still not being treated as essential, still being treated as disposable, really. And the wildfires, especially in rural towns like Talent and Phoenix, where a majority of farm workers lost their homes, their mobile homes, entire communities that burnt down, and those people are not entitled to FEMA support. How and all of this connects to climate change. It connects our rural communities with our agricultural workers, our small towns really being frontline communities on some of the biggest and most consequential things that we're seeing in climate change today. And we're trying to not just find these short-term solutions to try to get people, you know, rapid deployment of resources and, you know, PPE, something as simple as an N95 mask when we're under evacuation orders, but also these long-term changes where we really want to see a whole new economy that can really be transformative and that can really address what we need to do around the climate crisis that we have today. And also, I think another challenge that's been really front and center during the pandemic is just the fact that large corporations, large employers just have too much power and are always getting the benefit of the doubt when our people are victims to COVID-19 outbreaks in the workplace. And basically, this means that our workers just are not seeing our agencies, we're not seeing our governments, we're not seeing anyone taking bold action to protect workers who are making sure that people are fed. And unfortunately, despite having labor laws and rules and regulations, we have not been able to see these agencies actually take matters in a way that really prioritize the health and safety of workers. So we're also looking into trying to pass some whistleblower enforcement policies. I think we know that if we want to get it done, it's got to be us. Unfortunately, we can't really depend on anybody to take care of us. And you know, the pandemic showed us that, the wildfires showed us that, and you know, this hasn't showed us anything different. I think another thing that also just really resonates, which I heard also from the other panelists, is just the voter suppression and our fight to maintain our democracy, our fight against the right trying to destroy democracy, and making sure that all voices are heard, that BIPOC low-wage workers are heard, that rural communities are heard, and that we do something to change this. I think we're at a pivotal moment in our country. Everyone's feeling it. There's a lot of uncertainty about what democracy looks like in the future, and it's definitely a conversation that's happening intergenerationally with our with our mothers and our fathers and the whole family, kind of saying, you know, what's happening here. So I think that those are, and then one last thing I'll say also is, especially with our rural communities and our elders who have a digital divide, our communities who still speak Spanish or indigenous languages, it is actually not very easy for people to get access through places that we take for granted, like Instagram and Facebook and emails, right? People really do depend on more localized approaches to their information. And that has been something we've been pushing hard, but it still seems like even with all the emergencies that are happening, that infrastructure has not been put in place to make sure that people are communicated with in the best way possible when these massive emergencies, natural disasters are happening.
Thank you, Reyna. And, as you were speaking, I appreciate so much that you lifted up the relationship between Black sharecroppers and Latinx farm workers. I had the chance to interview my father last year for this storytelling project. And my father started working at the age of 8, picking cotton in Mississippi. And he was sharing with me, he said that one of the things that he remembered from his childhood was that even though he couldn't speak English, he remembered that the Black community members who were picking alongside them, they were always so kind, and that was such a strong memory that he had. And it really, I just want to shine a light on that, because I think there isn't we don't have enough conversation about how Black and Brown people have always worked closely together and have been making and sharing community across our country. So really, thanks for raising that. And so that story leads me to my next question that's about stories. And, all of you know that I care very much about the stories we tell and the stories that are told about our communities. And Sarah, I want to come to you for this, just to kick us off, because you have spent a lot of your time focusing on storytelling of the Native and Indigenous community members of your community. So, why to you is storytelling so important, and what are you doing in some of the projects that you are working on to lift up the narrative, the narrative that we craft about the community that you serve and that you're from?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I spent a lot of my time on storytelling. I think, early in my career, I wanted to be a storyteller, and then the issues and needs of my communities pulled me into like nonprofit, leadership, right? And now I'm coming full circle and saying like, no, I can do whatever I want to do, and I need to have that storytelling outlet as well as, have the ability to help my community. So I crafted a nonprofit that way that shares leadership. So I have a co-CEO that helps me, right? So that I can actually do all the other work that I need to do. So the one reason that I would say it's so important is that Native Americans are really in a race against time. And especially this has become even more apparent with COVID, right? COVID has affected our elders, and our elders are our language keepers, our culture bearers, and we've been fighting against oppression and colonization. And so many of us are fighting to keep our languages and to keep our culture and our identity. And rural communities hold that information right in the center of it with our elders and our people. So for me, the urgency could not be more dire, but I also feel that, the cultural nuances and protocols and all of that wisdom is really kept in those communities with those people. And of course, so that's connected. I have to work on COVID. I thought, I was like, okay, I have to like branch out and help these other women, because I saw that, when I won an Emmy for Crow the Legend for virtual reality, I know, thank you. I'll do the humble brag, not so humble right there. But I'm like one of the, only Native women that have an Emmy. And I did that because I worked with influencers and I partnered with them and I built bridges and we created a project about a forest and the animals in the forest and, how they could save the world and how the crow became Black. And then we won an Emmy. And then that unlocked networks for me that were not there for me previously, mind you. And I started getting invited to all of these other events of different people. And I began to see that I was one of the only women there. I was the only woman that was from a very rural community, from my own tribe. And I also saw that, I had made that jump through a lot of hard work. Rural women, you know how much harder we have to work to get to that same place? I mean, so then I started to think about, okay, how could I open the doors for other women who are artists and storytellers and organizers and help get them the funding that they need to tell their stories? So it's really about scaling and like multiplying the opportunities for more women. And so the other part that we're working on is we're working with our Prism, which does storytelling. And we've connected our society members to these, to Prism, who's doing rural distribution to these outlets that we actually need the stories to be told, because we need to change their mindsets about the people that are living right next door. So that was really important. And then of course, the other thing that I'm doing is I'm writing a book. It's a memoir / self-help book that's going to be published by Feminist Press next fall. I'm co-writing it with my identical twin sister, who's a psychotherapist. And our idea was really, we wanted to share Indigenous worldview with the world and understand, you know, we've been through so much trauma. We know everybody has a lot of trauma, but we also understood that our perspective and the cultural protective factors that we grew up with, and maybe sometimes take for granted, you know, it was time to really share some of that wisdom with the world. So just a little bit of what I'm working.
Thank you, Sarah, for all of that. And Ash, I want to come to you next with this question, because I know you have been working to tell the story of Black people in Appalachia, and you, and through the Highlander Center, have been so much of the recording of history of BIPOC folks in the South. Will you talk to us a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing, and that you personally have been doing, and that the center has been doing over time?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, it's also really beautiful to answer this question in the context of like women of color having a conversation about stories, when like that's our inheritance. You know, it's like I didn't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to learn how to tell a story. My grandmother taught me, you know, and probably her grandmother taught her, and it just feels it feels so intimately connected to the way that we get social change, right? Like I don't know how you would be able to believe that you can transform the material conditions of our people in this country without the use of stories. So I'm so grateful for the work that Sarah's doing, and that Reyna's done, and that Monica's doing to make sure that these stories are getting out, right? It's not for lack of being able to tell our stories, it's for lack of having ears to listen. That is, I think, impactful to our ability to build social movements power. So, you know, Highlander is a nearly 90-year-old organization. We've been bringing people together to figure stuff out since 1932. And it feels so timely to be thinking about these things, because Highlander was born, what was happening in the 30s, right? Like the Depression and the Dust Bowl, right? Like social collapse was happening. And the state was not meeting the needs of our people, right? And so these country people came together and said, you know, we're going to start school. we're going to bring people together across difference, because surely if we just learn together in a space where everybody's a teacher and everybody's a learner, we'll develop new knowledge that could only exist if those people sat in a room together in some rocking chairs for a few hours. And then we could take that new knowledge and not just be smarter people, because, you know, smarter people don't necessarily a world save, but we could take that new knowledge and do something with it when we go back home. And if we do that, we might fool around and win. We might fool around and save the world. We might fool around and see all of us at the finish line when we get there. And so, to be honest, when I came on as the first Black woman executive director of this historic space that brought us the labor movement, that was a landing place for the civil rights movement, that helped like really popularize language justice in movement spaces where people should be able to speak the tongues that they're most familiar with and most comfortable with in movement spaces, that did work around intergenerational organizing and cultural organizing and all of the methodologies of the Highlander Center. What's real is when we came on, and I came on as the first Black woman executive director, it was December of 2016 and 45 had just been elected president, and people were freaking out. And they were looking to us to tell them stories about how we'd overcome very similar white nationalists, very similar fascists, very similar authoritarian politics. And I think that it was sort of like a wake-up call to a lot of people to hear the stories of how like we'd been fighting and we'd been winning against these systems of oppression. And I mean, what else could be true of rural women than like we already did this? We've been down this road before. This is not our first rodeo. And so what are we doing now? Well, we're doing what they advised us, which was not to do something new, but to be innovative in a 21st century context about what we've always done, right? So the question, I think, the 21st century question of rural women isn't our ability to be successful. We know, the silver lining to me is that rural women work. And I know that we'll win because of that. The question isn't our ability to be successful in this sort of building a new world work. The question to me is, are folks going to invest in it to make it scalable, right? Who is controlling the camera in which I'm telling my story? And I think that the work of those of us that are griots, that are cultural bearers, that are storytellers, that are organizers and base builders, that are activists and people that shut shit down, whatever your role is in social movement, the question isn't, am I telling my story? The question is, are you hearing it? And what narratives, what stories are you making up in your own mind about where I'm from, right? So, for example, if you're talking about like rural America in a context of scarcity and deprivation and poverty and harm, even the true things that are honest about intercommunity violence amongst us, right? If that's the focus and not the literal generations long legacy of resistance and the generations long social movement building and organizational building that's been happening in these communities, then who does that serve? It certainly doesn't serve us. And so I feel like the work that folks on this call have been doing, and that folks that aren't even on this call that we represent have been doing, has been decoding rural America for people that never visit, right? This really brilliant woman, Helen Kim, was having a conversation with me, and I was mad about people talking crap about the country South. I was mad, fire hot. And she was like, Ash, like, yeah, you mad, that you get to be mad. That's right. That's righteous. Your rage is righteous. But can you explain to me how people that you talk to for an hour on a Zoom call are supposed to be able to, in that hour, understand everything about your lived experience as a Southern rural Black person? Might be difficult. And I was like, oh, wait, that's right. Like, the only stories that they hear about where I'm from is like deliverance, right? The only stories that they hear about where I'm from is that it's Trump country, is that it's this, is that it's that. They very rarely get to see it for what it truly is. And I get to be that glimpse. And so, though I think that there's still a responsibility of our like friends that are not from places where we live and love and have grown up and are growing up, to actually be receptive to those stories and to amplify them and to kick the doors down so that more rural people can tell the story for themselves, right? We have voices. You're not a voice for the voiceless. We can talk for ourselves. But there's also a responsibility for those of us that now have platforms to use it in service of the transformation of this country by making sure we're bringing our folks along with us. So I think, the biggest thing for me in storytelling is that I meet people where they're at, regardless of their understanding of where I'm from. I decode it for them, and then I don't leave them where I found them. I think that the biggest thing is that all of you that have listened to this amazing panel today now have a responsibility to say, when folks are talking about rural communities, like, nah, I know that's not true because I know Monica, and I know Reyna, and I know Sarah, and I know Ash. I heard their story. And if you want to know more about what they're doing, since you clearly don't know the cool kids in the rural communities, you should go and find them on social media. You should follow their organizations. You should invest and amplify their work, right? It's like, that's what accountability and solidarity looks like in practice and beyond theory.
Thank you so much, Ash. First of all, I could just listen all day and take in all the wisdom that each of you are sharing. And I appreciate so much, especially when you were talking about this notion of, people aren't the voice for the voiceless, and that, we need to make sure that people hear that over and over and over again. We can tell our stories, our people can tell their stories, and we need to find a way to make that happen. And I'm sad to say that we are out of time. And this is not the end of this conversation. We are having this conversation on a continuing basis. And for those of you who are listening, we want you to keep having the conversation with us. And we want you to invest in the work, invest in each of the organizations that have been part of this conversation. And I want to give the last word to Ash, Sarah, and to Reyna to tell people how to support them in their work. So, Reyna, please tell people where to find you and how can they support PCUN.
Gracias. Well, I would say the easiest way is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, PCUN Oregon, just search. And also signing up for our newsletter is a very easy way to get engaged, just www.pecun.org.
Great. And Sarah?
Yeah, you can find Return to the Heart under Return to Heart on Instagram. And then we're also on Facebook. Follow us, follow for the stories. I mean, we're always amplifying other groups of people. You can also follow Sisters Rising. And we're on Instagram and Twitter. And that's really where we're doing the intersection of our work right now.
Great. And Ash, tell people where they can find you and how to support.
Absolutely. I mean, you can find me and the Highlander Center on all social medias. Like Reyna said, the newsletter is also a way to not only know about our work, but to see the literally thousands of organizations that we support on a regular basis in Appalachia, in the Deep South, around the country, and globally. It's called The View from the Hill. It comes out weekly, and you can find it at highlandercenter.org.
Thank you. And for those of you who've been listening, it's important for you to remember that rural America is diverse, that rural women, that BIPOC people in rural America have been and are and always will be leading in our communities and across our country. And that change happens when you can truly see us for who we are and what we have to offer. Change will only come if we all invest in the truth, which is that there are people of color in our communities across rural America who've been contributing for decades, for centuries, and we're not going to stop, but we can't make the change that's needed if you don't join us. So join us, follow us, support us, and invest in us. Thank you.